In this video, we are going to solve using square root method. So our objective is to be able to solve quadratic equations using the square root method. So some of the things that are review are knowing what perfect squares are. We talked about this with simplifying radicals. Simplifying radicals, determining perfect square factors, isolating x squared and taking the square root of each side, as well as isolating a binomial and taking the square root of each side. So these are some of the skills we're going to talk about today when solving by square root method. So the first number I have is x squared equals 9. So to undo a squared, we're going to take the square root of both sides. And actually, when we take the square root of both sides, we're actually not only going to get x equals positive 3, but we're also going to get x equals negative 3, and we're going to write this as plus or minus 3. This is because if I squared negative 3, I would get 9. And if I squared positive 3, I would get 9. So every quadratic is going to have two solutions. So that's basically two solutions. So the second one, we're going to do the same thing, square root, square root. The square root of 144 is 12, but again, it'd be plus or minus 12. Square root, square root. All right, well, 12 does not square root. So x is going to equal plus or minus the square root of 12. But this is now where we think about how we're going to reduce 12. So 4, 9, 16 is too high. So 9 doesn't go into 12, but 4 does. So this would break down into the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. The square root of 4 is going to turn into 2. So it's going to be plus or minus 2 square root 3. All right, I'm going to skip this one. But in this one, I need to get the x squared alone. So to get the x squared alone, I'm going to minus 1. So then I'll get that x squared is 25. Take the square root of both sides, and the square root of 25 is 5. So in this case, it's plus or minus 5. To get x squared alone, I'm going to add 2. So x squared is going to equal 18. Square root both sides. All right, 18 does not square root, so I'm going to leave it as plus or minus the square root of 18. But then I need to think about what perfect square is going to go into 18, and the answer is 9. So x would equal plus or minus the square root of 9 times the square root of 2, because 9 times 2 would give me 18. So square root of 9 is going to turn into 3. So I'm going to have 3 plus or minus 3 square root 2. So again, what this means is that x equals 3 square root 2 and x equals negative 3 square root 2. That is what the plus or minus means. It means we have the positive and the negative solution. So we have two solutions. Two solutions. All right, let's keep going. So I want to get this 2x squared alone first. So first I'm going to minus 1. Then I want to get x squared alone. So I'm going to get rid of the 2 by dividing. Now to get rid of the squared, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. 8 does not square root, so I'm going to write it as plus or minus the square root of 8. So now I'm going to break 8 down. So the only perfect square that could go into 8 is 4, which it does. 8 is 4 times 2. So square root of 4 is going to become 2. So x is going to equal plus or minus 2 square root 2. All right, this situation is a little bit different. I want to get this quantity x plus 1 squared alone. So to do that, I'm going to divide by 4. I cannot distribute the 4 in because this exponent has to come before I would multiply because of order of operations. So I need to divide by 4. So it'll leave me with x plus 1 quantity squared equals 25. Now this whole quantity is squared, so that means I can take the square root of both sides. So what this is going to do is when I take the square root of the left side, I'm just going to have x plus 1. But the square root of 25 would be plus or minus 5. So really I'm going to end up with two equations. X plus 1 equals 5 and x plus 1 equals negative 5. So I'm going to minus 1. One of the solutions is that x equals 4. I'm going to minus 1, and my other solution is that x equals negative 6. Similarly, in this next problem, I want to get this x plus 2 quantity squared alone. So I'm going to add the 4. So I'll end up with x plus 2 quantity squared equals 36. All right, now I want to get this alone, so I'm going to take the square root of both sides because that'll get x plus 2 alone. The square root of 36 is going to be plus or minus 6. So again, I'm going to have x plus 2 equals 6, and x plus 2 equals negative 6. So then I'm going to solve these. So minus 2, so one of my solutions will be 4. And then minus 2, one of my solutions will be negative 8. The last thing we're going to talk about is what happens when we have a negative under the square root. And this is super important. So now we are going to talk about if we have the square root of negative 1, it is equal to I. So how do I demonstrate that? Let's demonstrate that. So to get x alone, in this case, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So that means I'm going to get plus or minus the square root of negative 1. Now before, when we took the square root of a negative, we always told you you're not allowed to because it would be a non-real number. Well, now we're going to talk about something called complex or imaginary numbers. So the square root of negative 1, like we said, is equal to I. So this is just going to be x is equal to plus or minus I, because that's the square root of negative 1. Now, if we have a number with it like the 16, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So x is going to equal plus or minus the square root of negative 16. Now, I'm going to pull out that negative 1. So I'm going to end up with plus or minus square root of 16 times the square root of negative 1. So this square root of negative 1 is going to become I. So I'm going to, and then 16 is going to become 4. So I'm going to end up with plus or minus 4I. So again, the 16 became 4, the square root of 16 became 4, and this square root of negative 1 became I. So that's how I get plus or minus 4I. All right, let's solve this last one. So I want to get this x squared alone. So the first thing I'm going to do is add 3. Then I'm going to divide by 4. And I'm going to get that x squared equals negative 9. So now when I take the square root of both sides, I'm going to end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 9. Now the square root of negative 9 is going to change into plus or minus the square root of 9 times negative 1. So plus or minus the square root of 9 has become 3, and the square root of negative 1 is I. So it'll be plus or minus 3I.